Want to say good afternoon to everyone. As our participants start to come online, we want to thank folks for joining us today. We especially want to thank our presenter for today and are very excited to welcome again to Texas, even if it's virtually, Ji-Hang Lee, who is the president and CEO of the Association of Community College Trustees. We're excited for those of us who will be joining him in Washington, D.C. next week to visit the nation's capital and to be able to do our National Legislative Summit in person. And so Ji-Hang very graciously has agreed to give us a sneak peek or an early view or a primer. I'm not sure exactly what we're going to call it, but to give us an overview of both the events for NLS as well as the federal legislative agenda. So we're very happy to be offering this to our Texas trustees today and look forward to hearing what he has to say. Before we jump into the presentation, I do want to, for those present who may not have seen the quick news yesterday that came out at the end of the day, but Nicole Eversman, one of our fellow former trustees from Austin Community College, has just started as our new director for the Community College Association of Texas Trustees. We're very excited to have someone with Nicole's background and passion in community college, and are excited to be welcoming her on this side or on that side of the fence, so that her expertise is not only a community college student and graduate, but as a trustee. We just think that there's going to be a great value to the work that we do on behalf of our trustees across the state. You'll hear from Nicole just a little bit later on, but I wanted to give her a chance to say hello very quickly before we jump into the program, since this is her first official event.
Thank you so much, Carol. And I am really excited to transition into this role and switch to full-time focus on cat advocacy. And thanks again for being here with us today. And thank you to Ji-Hang Lee for spending time.
Thanks, Nicole. So as we go through, please put your questions in the Q&A and or the chat boxes so that Nicole can facilitate those at the end of the presentation. And then, of course, we will have an opportunity for live Q&A as well. So with that, I'm going to officially introduce Ji-Hang Lee, the president and CEO of ACCT. He started in this role in November of last year after having served ACCT for 15 years, including a long stint as vice president for public policy and external relations. Again, welcome, Ji-Hang, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, Carol, thank you so much for the invitation, and good afternoon to our fellow trustees and presidents in Texas. I look forward to seeing all of you hopefully soon in Washington, D.C. as we get ready for our National Legislative Summit. As part of my presentation today, we're just going to kind of walk through some of our legislative priorities that we have outlined for all of you to hopefully provide a primer on some of the things that we're working on here in Washington and that we need your support to assist in sending that message of importance to Capitol Hill and also to the administration. So if we can get the PowerPoint up, we will get started. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the notable legislations for us in 2021, as you can imagine, in the last 2 years, starting since the beginning of the pandemic in February, March of 2020 till last year, or even till earlier this year, actually last year, I forgot that we're in 2022. We worked heavily on trying to access additional revenue and resources for colleges to fight the pandemic and support our college students through the trials and tribulations of what transpired with economic loss and also transitioning to a number of activities that our colleges have been doing in the height of the pandemic. So a couple pieces of legislation, the American Rescue Plan passed last year. In addition, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act also passed in 2021. The pending legislations that we're going to have you articulate and advocate for are two components. It's the broad pieces of legislation are called the Build Back Better, and there will be provisions in there that we would like you to talk about and support, and also the fiscal year 22 appropriations process and the fiscal year 23 appropriations process. But honestly, Congress needs to get 22 done before they can do the 23 legislation. Next slide, please. So just as a background information for all of you, the American Rescue Plan was the third installment of the stimulus resources that came to our institutions. That was signed into law on March 11th of 2021. For those of you who recall and participated on our NLS, which was virtual at that point, that was one of our top priorities to ensure that we've got some additional resources for our students and for our institutions. Some high points that were important for us as part of the stimulus legislation. Institutions received a significant amount of money increase from the original CARISA, which was the second installment, and the first installment, the CARES Act. In total, the ARP had $39.6 billion for higher education. We call that HERF, and I'll just say that having been your lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, there is nothing better for a lobbyist than acronyms. So hopefully you want to ask me what each acronym means, but the funding allocation was almost $40 billion. The big fight last year that we had, and in the fall of 2020, was to change the formula of allocation for our institutions. When the CARES Act, which was the first stimulus legislation, was enacted, they utilize 100% full-time equivalent as their measurement for college allocations. And obviously for community colleges with a great deal of part-time students, including those students who, including all students, because they also did a Pell number of FTE and a regular FTE. We needed to ensure that headcount was ultimately utilized for that allocation. Ultimately, for stimulus part 2 and stimulus part 3, they did do a mesh between headcount and FTE, which we're very thankful for, and therefore it did increase your allocations as an institution. The other things in the American Rescue Plan, just for colleges, had to spend at least 50% of its allocation for student emergency funds. And also institutional funds are flexible and can be used to offset lost revenue. And that lost revenue went all the way back to March 13th, 2020. Next slide, please. So ARP compared to the previous two stimulus legislations, what did increase, the CARES Act was a baseline stimulus legislation. Congress worked on part 2, which is called CARISA, and CARISA, which was signed into law in December, increased the allocation, but there was an even a bigger jump up for the ARP. As I mentioned, they had the mix of headcounts. And most importantly, as part of all these resources, ensure that there's flexibility for institutions on how they use those funds, and also the timeline for the process. For those of you who are coming to Washington, D.C., we will have various dignitaries from the Department of Education attending our conference. If you have not gotten your waiver for usages of funds, that's probably a good time to at least broach the subject with those political officials to initiate that conversation. Next slide. Okay. ARP funding updates. This one significant update. Last week, the Department of Education announced that they were inviting applications for a grant opportunity under the Supplemental Support Program under ARP. It's $198 million. The funds are designated to support colleges and universities with the greatest unmet needs. They are looking especially at community colleges, and they're also especially looking at rural colleges as part of this mix. Eligible institutions can use these funds to monitor the coronavirus, strengthen basic needs for students, strengthen enrollment patterns and re-enrollment, forgive institutional debt, and also expand programs for in-demand positions. We're excited about this new grant opportunity, and I believe there'll be some more explanation during the legislative summit about how to apply and some of the additional focuses of the Department of Education. Next slide, please. Guidance updates for ARP. I know this is important for at least the college presidents on this call. There's announced new guidance on how colleges can use new and existing ARP funds to support basic needs, such as housing and food insecurity. The guidance provides examples and models from community colleges and how colleges and universities can use institutional portion of their HERF to make investments into the support for our students. The department is also sending a Dear Colleague letter to all colleges, all public and private colleges, informing them that they can use the FAFSA data to communicate with students about their eligibility for public benefits that they might be eligible for. This is something that's been relatively important as our work around basic needs to ensure that low-income students are made aware of additional federal benefits they might be eligible for. Okay, next slide. So this Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation that passed the Senate in August, and it ultimately did pass into law and got signed into law in November 15th of last year. It provides $1.2 billion in additional resources for infrastructure. There's not per se a piece of this puzzle that is specifically for community colleges, but community colleges can benefit, number one, and number two, they can partner with other community agencies to gain access to these resources. The one resource that we would flag for all of you is that they provided in this bill $65 billion for broadband access. As we all know, broadband has become a significant driver in college access and for enrollment during this pandemic, and has also showcased that there is a wide discrepancy even in urban areas between being connected to the internet and being able to take online courses. So there's a significant amount of money for implementation grants. Those would be grants to states to enact this policy. But there's also resources, for example, such as the Rural Broadband Connectivity Program, which would be based for rural communities, tribal broadband connectivity, and then some additional resources for that middle mile broadband projects. So that is something that you should be working and communicating with your local stakeholders, local government stakeholders, to see, one, to do some applications, and two, be able to benefit from that expansion, especially for your students. Okay, next slide. So as we come into 2022, obviously there's a big signature piece of legislation that was pushed by President Biden in 2021. It's called Build Back Better. For all intents and purposes, it's still kind of hanging out, and it's hanging out because it passed the House, and it's still waiting action in the Senate. The Senate, especially Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, have put some pause on this piece of legislation because they have some concerns, one, about the funding level in the program and the overall bill, but also number two, about some specific provisions. Some notable provisions that are included: number one, there's over $40 billion for higher education and workforce programs in Build Back Better, as was passed in the House. A couple of items: number one, it would increase the Pell Grant maximum by $550, and that maximum increase would be specifically just for public college students and private not-for-profit students. If you went to a for-profit college, you would not be eligible for that additional $550. The other thing it does is it expands Title IV eligibility to our DACA students, our TPS students, and deferred enforcement departure students. It makes Pell Grant dollars tax-free. This is something that is not necessarily well known, but if you are a low-income student and receive a Pell Grants, you get taxed on any amount of your Pell Grants that is used for cost of attendance. That is basically charges outside of course materials and tuition and fees. So everything else that you utilize, get Pell Grants to support childcare, food, housing, all of that, you get an additional tax. And we made Congress aware that this would be a significant driver or a problem for us, for our students, especially as we think about College Promise and the proliferation of college promise programs across the country. There are some additional resources for retain and completion strategies. It's about $500 million over a period of time, and this would help students complete their degree and credential. It invests a significant amount of resources to our minority serving institutions, including our historically Black colleges and universities, our tribal colleges, university, our Hispanic serving institutions, our predominantly Black colleges, and our UNAPISI's American Native American serving institutions. The one piece that is sizable, it invests in workforce development, including an over $5 billion with a B, investment around community college workforce programs, and sector-based partnerships and apprenticeships. So that is one of the key items that we will be asking all of you to lobby on to ensure that our states are able to get those resources and distributed out to our colleges to support their workforce needs. Okay. As with all things, for those of you who have been watching and have carefully been looking at what transpires in Washington, D.C., Congress typically, our typical fiscal year for the federal government starts on October 1st and ends on September 30th. We typically don't ever abide by that timeline, and last year was no different. So essentially, Congress last year for our fiscal year kicked our appropriations budget FY22 and kicked it all the way out to February 18th. And this is an opportunity for Congress to work and collectively to figure out what the heck they want to do for this year's appropriations process. The House did move a certain number of bills as standalone pieces of legislations, and including they moved the labor, HHS, and education appropriations bill, which for us in the community college sector is the most important piece of legislation, but it includes allocations for such things as the Pell Grant program, and additional grant programs that our colleges receive, including work studies, supplemental educational opportunity grants, and then our minority serving grant allocations that we typically receive. The Senate Democrats did unveil their own proposal, but they never marked it up and moved it out of committee or even to the floor of the Senate. So therefore, at this point, we are looking at primarily the activity of the House, and then the Senate has not done as much. And so we are kind of scrambling to figure out what Congress will ultimately do. Typically, the way that they negotiate these pieces of legislation is they have a top line for each of these bills, and then this House and Senate start to negotiate on those top lines and start filling the tree to meet that top line. They have not done much activity on this, and so we are looking at a deadline of February 18th when Congress, in theory, could send the federal government into a shutdown. It is our expectation that Congress will not go into shutdown and that they will do some type of extension or funding called a continuing resolution, which funds everything at the same number of the previous year. And that will be an outward on to February 18th. As a caveat, the end of our fiscal year is September 30th. So I would guess it behooves us to try to move this and finalize this before September 30th when we begin another fiscal year. Okay, so that's kind of those two major items that we're working on in Washington, D.C. is on the funding. I would say, just as a caveat on the funding, we continue to advocate for increasing the Pell Grant maximum and increasing some additional resources for things like our child care means access program, in addition to some of our smaller minority serving institution grants that haven't been increases as much in the last cycle. But we're excited to see some of you in Washington, D.C. to fight for some of these programs, because we think they're very important for your students, and we're also think it's very important for your communities to get access to these federal resources. So this is my personal email address, and I think Nicole's going to ask me some questions relative to as we lead up to NLS. So I'll let her do that. But this is my email address. If you ever need anything from ACCT, let us know. Our public policy, we do have alerts that go out to our membership around key issue areas. Please sign up for that, and you can sign up through our public policy at acct.org. We have a robust website, and we have an NLS website, and we do kind of have a preparing for NLS, but I'm going to turn it over to Nicole for additional questions, and I think she has a couple for me.
Yes, thank you so much for that overview. And it's exciting to be going to DC right before the February 18th deadline, I would say. Are you expecting that action might be taken while we're having the NLS?
I would imagine, they haven't been moving too much on the appropriations bill, so our strong expectation is they'll just punt it for another couple weeks. I think a lot of appropriators, and one of the reasons why Build Back Better kind of stalled was everybody was looking at the inflation and what has transpired relative to inflation and its impact on the stock market and our economy. So that's something that is on the horizon, and we're kind of monitoring. But our strong expectation is they'll do something, because if they don't do anything, the government shuts down on the 18th. It just, it is what it is.
Well, before I forget, I'm going to throw a link in the chat for our attendees. If you have not yet registered to join us for our breakfast in DC, that is something that's going to be going on during the conference. And back to you, Jihang, I'm wondering if your membership from other states is running into difficulty scheduling meetings on Capitol Hill. I know that a lot of our Texas delegation is running into a lot offices that aren't taking meetings or are only doing virtual.
Yeah, it's an interesting time right now in Washington, D.C. We obviously, when we planned this NLS, we came right after our fall meeting in California. That was when Delta was kind of going on, and there was a down period, and then Omicron came around. And our board is committed to meeting in person, so we have not deviated from holding an in-person NLS. That being said, Omicron has obviously had an impact, especially in the Northeast. It has now started to migrate westward. And so it is the prevalent strain right now. DC, for the most part, has been okay, especially in the last week or so. And the rates for us the DC has started to candidly plummet. But I know it's been difficult to schedule meetings. Our rule of thumb that we're communicating to our membership is that when you do try to schedule a meeting, when you tried 2 weeks ago, it was in the height of Omicron in Washington, D.C. Next week, saying, hey, we're coming into town the following week, it might be a little bit different. So I think that there's a certain level of persistence that is required to get these meetings scheduled. We do also know that some senators, for example, they had scheduled their own meetings to bring delegations into like this Capitol Visitor Center, or even their, in a room in the Capitol. We have been hearing that they have been asking delegations to house those meetings at the hotel. So it's easier for them to come in and do those presentations and speeches and have discussions versus, 50 people coming in through to the Capitol. There's only, it's easier for them to come to the hotel and just, meet with people. So we have heard some of that, but in addition, we have heard, if you're especially in a competitive congressional race, we have heard that they are especially doing in-person meetings because they feel that's important. So it's kind of all up in the air, and it kind of is member dependent.
Great, that's some important context. And I see we had a question from Jeanette McCown about our meetings with our Texas senators. And at this point, we don't have any meetings scheduled with the senators, Senator Cruz or Senator Cornyn. But based on what I just heard from Ji Hang, I'm going to reach out again next week and see if they've changed their mind.
Yeah, the one recommendation that we do have is if they want, if you do get something and they'll say that they'll come to the hotel, let us know as soon as possible and see if we can get you guys a room so you guys can utilize that room as kind of a focal location for your Senate meetings.
Great, thank you. And now I see Raymond has asked about how was the registration numbers for the NLS this year as compared to before?
So I would say registration was super strong going into about mid-January, about comparable to our totals. Last week was we did see a decline of about 10%. We are still expecting about 700 people in Washington, D.C. for our legislative summit. So we're very excited about that. Our Congress, which was our ACCT Congress, which was in San Diego last year, had about a 10% decline, 15% decline in participation. We're essentially around that same number now. So that's kind of our expectation, at least for right now. I would just note, Washington, D.C., the DC mayor did institute two things. So this is something notable for our registrants. Number one, she has implemented an indoor vaccination policy for those of you who are attending the hotel or are going to be at the hotel and attending the conference. There is an exemption relative to medical and religious exemptions. That's something that you should ping me about if you're going to be utilizing that. But the hotel will be checking your vaccination status when you would like to, when you first come in and try to attend the conference. This also is in place for restaurants in Washington, D.C. If you're just ordering out, it does not exist. You don't have to show. But if you're eating inside the restaurants, that's what's transpiring for everybody right now in Washington, D.C. And I would just note, we are planning to be in New York City in the fall, in October. And New York City actually had the same rules in place, but they actually had these rules in place going back to the summer of 2021. So this is just kind of a foreshadowing. You do not need to have your physical vaccination card. You can just take a picture. They will ask for a picture, and they'll just want to verify that it's you when they look at your vaccination card.
Great. And I remember at the conference in October, you had the different color lanyards based on how comfortable someone was with social distancing.
Yes,
so plan for this one.
Yeah, we this time around we won't be doing that. And the primary reason why we're not doing it is we ran out of green and yellow lanyards. So it's kind of like the stoplights, that you see every day. Green, go, yellow, caution, red, stop. I had a number of people who told me after the fact, Ji Hang, I had to use a red lanyard, but I should be green. So we just decided, you could just put your hand up if you don't want to, hug somebody or give high five. but most everybody that came was pretty comfortable with what transpired at our event.
Great. And another question I have for you is, if somebody's attending NLS for the first time, and this is maybe their first chance to have a meeting at Capitol Hill, like, what is the run of show, and what would you tell them to do instead of reading the green sheet word for word?
Yeah, so there's two things that I would just mention. One is we believe our meetings are important because it provides an avenue for all of our attendees and our membership to meet other people across this country, to pick each other's brains, and to network. We think it's an important and valuable component to our meetings. So one, you should utilize that opportunity, learn, sit next to somebody from Illinois, North Carolina, Massachusetts, New York, learn a little bit more about their work as trustees in other parts of the country. The run of show for us is Mondays primarily we jam pack it in. Just to give you kind of a schedule at a glance of Monday, we'll have the president and CEO of the National Student Clearinghouse. We'll be talking about the FY21 college enrollment data and what's transpiring, especially for community colleges and the students that are missing from our colleges since the start of the pandemic. We'll have a priority session, which will go through all those priorities that I mentioned previously. We'll have Secretary Miguel Cardona, the Secretary of Education, joining us for our luncheon. We'll also have Major Garrett, who's the Chief White House Correspondent for CBS News, as our luncheon speaker. We'll have a series of policy sessions, one on higher education, one on workforce, and the other one will be focused on a SNAP program. Then we'll have some state delegation meetings. We also have some special constituency groups, the African American trustees, the Latino trustees, and the Asian Pacific Islander trustees will be doing their own meetings. And then Tuesday morning, you'll have their Texas breakfast. And then you'll have, right after the Texas breakfast, we have the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, will be there. Hopefully we'll be talking a little bit about some of the grant funding opportunities available to community colleges. And then after that, that usually gives you about like a 6-hour window of time to get some meetings in. Also meet with some delegations from the Department of Education and other agencies. And then we'll have a gala, which is our banquet to honor congressional members. And we'll also be we'll have a leader, a congressional member doing our Wednesday breakfast, who is leading our efforts around the short-term Pell program. There was a question about the secretaries. The secretaries will be in person. All of our attendees for our conference are all attending in person. So we are hopeful that they continue to be in person. And like I said, the rates in DC have gotten better. Terry, we have what we will be doing for those attendees that are not attending. We cannot, I'll just be candid, we're a 20-person operation at ACCT. It's too difficult for us to try to run an in-person show and do it hybrid at the same time. And it's an added expense that we decided not to do. What we will do, though, is we will be taping, especially the general sessions, and then uploading them so people can watch them next week, the week after our annual meeting. So Secretary Cardona's speech, Secretary Walsh's speech will be available online.
Excellent, thank you. I've got one more question for you. So if anyone else wants to throw something else in the chat, I welcome that. But I remember our legislative green sheets in the past, and one aspect of that used to be second chance Pell for incarcerated individuals. And can you talk about the state of affairs for those types of programs right now?
Yeah, so actually, Nicole, let me get back to your second part of your question. When you do come to Washington, D.C., one of the things that we always tell colleges to do as a preparation is, one, we spend an enormous amount of paper and time in creating backgrounders for all of you to read. I believe the backgrounders is like 15 pages long. You don't have to read all of it, but we encourage you to read the sections that you're supposed to talk about. And then we also have something called, affectionately called, a green sheet, which is our top priorities for any given calendar year. So in 2022, we'll have a green sheet that outlines a number of priorities. As you prepare for meetings, you should be talking to the other people from your institution about your priorities, and figuring out who might be the best spokesperson for each individual priority. Some delegations bring a college student, so that college student might be the best person, especially if they're a Pell Grant student, to talk about certain pieces of the student financial aid program that they're connected to. And so that, and the other thing that we strongly recommend as you do your meetings, especially with representatives, we encourage you to take some time to play, to play roles for the meeting, and also kind of do a run through. One thing that we do know that sometimes happens, this is not a suggested way of doing a meeting. We sometimes know there might be some disagreements about certain priorities, and we always tell colleges, one, the green sheet is an association-wide priorities of our association, along with American Association of Community Colleges. They aren't necessarily the top priorities of your institution. So your institution should take a look at the green sheet and figure out which priorities they would like to talk about first and foremost, and go from there. And that will help you with a role play. An additional point is, as a reminder, it's probably best not to disagree with each other, especially in a public meeting with your representative. Those meetings typically, we have heard, sometimes happen, and it's most likely then going to be a waste of time for the member, because they're not going to get any benefit from it, and it'll probably be then a waste of your time since you spent time on doing that meeting. So prioritize your list of asks, utilize college data for those asks, think about who might be the best spokesperson for each ask, and be agreeable, not disagreeable. In terms of Second Chance Pell, in 2020, one of our top priorities for us as an organization was to get the ability of our institutions to, who are working within the prison system, to offer Pell Grants to those individuals that are incarcerated. They lost their ability to access Title IV aid. And so therefore colleges had to utilize their own resources or state resources if there was available resources, or the individual had to offer those resources to take courses. We were successful in getting Second Chance Pell authorized in the fall of 2020, or the winter of 2020. And so therefore we were, colleges now can participate. Obviously there are some limitations right now just because of the way COVID has impacted all enrollments, and the ability of running these programs, I would say, has been a little bit sporadic given what has transpired with COVID, and especially in 2021 to 2022.
Great. Thank you for spending so much time with us today. And I haven't seen any other questions come in. Do you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to share? Or I see Carol's jumping back on.
Well, I guess my concluding thing is, like, one, I want to thank, the association, the Trustees Association and TAC for your continued support of ACCT. I want to just thank all of our member institutions for supporting your national association. We can't do the work here in Washington, D.C. without your, membership support, but also your volunteer participation within your association. Carol already knows what her ask is of fellow trustees as we look for a state coordinator from Texas, and someone decided to take a different job. So that's something else. And I would be remiss to say, we obviously at ACCT have a strong relationship with Texas. Our chair-elect is one of your own, Rose Benavidez from South Texas College. So we're excited to have a very close relationship for years to come.
Thank you, Ji-Hang. And that's actually what my closing comments were going to be around the partnership that the CAT organization and ACCT have had over the 7 years that I've been a trustee. And certainly I know that there's folks on the call longer who've been trustees longer than that, and appreciate that connection between the two organizations. We are looking for a state coordinator. If you've been around ACCT at all, you've seen some information about that in the past. So if you are a regular attendee, because one of the requirements of the state association is that you can meet in person. It's not 100% of the time, but the expectation is that both for the annual Congress and NLS, that's when the state coordinators group meets. And so we ask that you have the ability to attend those functions on a regular basis. But the real important part is to talk about what's going on in the state, to help serve as a liaison between Texas and the national board and the leadership. And so certainly that would be the part of what CAT does in terms of answering some of those questions. But we're looking for somebody to help serve that role. I see that Raymond put that he thinks Nicole should take the job. She actually had the job. She's no longer a trustee. She's now a staff person. So we do have to find a trustee that can take that position.
Well, Raymond, I would just say great minds think alike, and it was perfect. When we pitched this idea to Nicole in September of last year, when I saw all of you in Austin, but obviously situations have changed.
That's right. That's right. And then lastly, I wanted to reiterate, Nicole talked about the Texas delegation breakfast that we're going to have on February 8th. So if you're going to NLS and haven't signed up for that yet, please do. And then give you a save the date for those who look and plan their calendars far in advance. June 16th through the 18th is going to be our CAT annual conference in Houston this year. You'll see more information about that coming in the coming days and weeks. But one, for those of you, again, who plan ahead, wanted you to be aware of that as well. So with that, thank you, Nicole. Welcome. Thank you so much, Ji-Hang, for again, spending the time with us and for the excellent information today. And look forward to seeing you all in Washington, D.C. Next week. Bring your snowshoes and your warm coat.
Warm coat, hopefully no snowshoes.
Thanks so much,
Again,
everyone.
everybody.
Have a great afternoon.
Okay, bye-bye.